incidentally, is also a resident expert with co-founders team with the co-director, Devaki Naik, who is the founder of Naik Forensics. She's an independent forensic accountant with masters in criminology and grad in economic offenses from New York. So, Devaki, the question, as you know, that we have posed for you is forensic accounting only good for post-mortem of scams, or can it help prevent frauds in startup? And the reason, as you know, the question has been posed to you is a lot of startups are going belly up purely because they do not have the time to kind of plug the holes. Sometimes the holes are actually created mindfully by founders or by vested interests. Investors certainly don't have the time to micromanage the leaks, and that's where forensic accounting comes in. So over to you, and your time starts now.
Thank you, Sachin, for that gracious introduction. Without wasting any time, I have put together a few slides to keep the conversation focused. So I hope the screen is visible. Please confirm so I can begin.
Is. Yeah, it is.
Okay. Okay, great. So forensic accounting, can it prevent frauds in startups? Let's find out. So to start the conversation on a lighter note, just like there are two sides to a coin, there are two sides to fraud. You are either the victim of it or you are the perpetrator. The consequences of being on either side are equally bad. And today's conversation is about how this can be prevented by you as a founder or you as an investor. So what exactly does a startup fraud look like? It could be all this and much more. If there is one takeaway that you remember after my slot of 10 minutes, I would like it to be this, that you are not immune to fraud. It could happen to you, or even worse, intentionally or unintentionally, you could be committing a fraud. So having said that, let's see if forensic accounting could be a savior. I'm sure everyone here understands the term accounting. However, there might be some misjudgment about the term forensic. Forensic literally means anything that could be produced in a court of law. So the report given by a forensic accountant acts as an evidence in a court of law. I'm often told, accountant to hai hamare paas. Why do we need a forensic accountant? To answer that question, the scope of an accountant is quite narrow. However, a forensic accountant tends to look beyond the numbers. To give you a very small example, one of the recent cases that I worked on, I was asked to do a due diligence for a food establishment. So we started looking at the numbers, the balance sheet, the books of accounts. We saw a lot of entries under the category repairs and maintenance. We went one step further and looked at the parties to whom these payments were being made under this repairs and maintenance category. So our first red flag was that more than 80% of the volume of payments was made to one party, and the rest, about 18-20%, were made to others. Our second red flag was that sequential invoices with repeated amounts, round figures, were raised by the party to whom these payments were made, the one party. Our third red flag, the services for which these payments were being made were not listed on their website, or the company was not known to provide those services. The last red flag was that there was no supporting document for the transactions that were happening. That means there were no invoices, there were no goods receipt notes, there were no documentation by the company for why these payments were being made. The party in question was a multi-crore revenue generating infrastructure company dealing in real estate. A food establishment is a cash generating business, like we all know. Real estate in India is also heavily reliant on cash. Now, the forensic accountant in me has already started thinking about the money laundering angle. Honoring the boundaries of my profession, I will not divulge the final findings on this matter. However, it is interesting to note that before the forensic team stepped in, all of these entries were already audited by a chartered accountant, and no eyebrows were raised for any of these red flags. So that leaves us with the question, is an accountant enough? Probably not. So some of the red flags of a fraudulent behavior could include missing documents, multiple payments to a single entity, several adjustment entries in the books of accounts. These are some of the common red flags which are often overlooked by small businesses, startups, and even multinationals. So, how can a forensic accountant help to mitigate these risk factors? We are often called in when the fraud has already occurred. So, instead of saying, दाल में कुछ काला है, दया दरवाजा तोड़ दो, we are often burdened with the task of a post mortem of a fraud, where the dead body is lying right in front of us, metaphorically, of course. The proactive approach is simple, cost effective, and less damaging to a business. However, it is also almost always the most overlooked approach. Something as simple as conducting a due diligence exercise on potential vendors, customers, partners could be a savior in more ways than one could imagine. Monitoring high value transactions, which now RBI has mandated in a certain economic threshold, but these things could be far more cost effective and time saving. The cost of non compliance with Indian or foreign laws can easily be avoided by taking a proactive approach. So, if there are so many benefits to taking the proactive approach, why businesses are still shying away from it? Let's look at some misconceptions revolving around the practice of forensic accounting. So, the first misconception that I would like to deal with is fraudsters only target large businesses. Absolutely false. Fraudsters target businesses which are vulnerable, and your startup is no exception to this. The second misconception, forensic accountants only get involved after a crime occurs. Again, this is false. By conducting risk assessments and suggesting best practices, forensic accountants can significantly reduce the likelihood of financial misconduct. The third misconception, it's easier or probably cheaper to write off fraud than to prevent it. Not at all true. Fraud prevention can be done in a cost-effective manner. And the last one, fraud prevention is a one-time effort. On the contrary, fraudsters are constantly evolving and finding new ways to commit frauds. Therefore, businesses need to be constantly updated, and their fraud prevention strategies need to be one step ahead of the fraudster. Having said all that, we come to the concluding remarks. Is forensic accounting really helpful for startups? And the answer is yes. To see your startup grow and flourish is probably the ultimate goal of every founder and investor. And forensic accounting or prudent practices can probably enable you to reach this goal better and more efficiently. So, with this food for thought, I would like to conclude the session and happy to take on any questions later on in the external group which Sachin has created for all of us. Thank you, Sachin, once again.
Thank you so much, Devaki. And I wasn't expecting any different an answer from you. You're absolutely right. Startups can certainly be extremely proactive, when it comes to preventing frauds. And the writing is on the wall with the kind of explosions that are happening left, right, and center. That startups better kind of wake up to the reality that they're not immune, and it's not as if a certain size of startups are vulnerable. Every startup, that is in business needs to kind of take forensic accounting seriously. We have also recommended it to a few startups where there are multiple co-founders. And while the trust is there, my submission has always been let the trust stay intact, but use a little more cement to reinforce the trust, as and when required. And I think that's where forensic accounting comes in.